One cacao tree should not have mattered this much. Yet on the dry soil of Burkina Faso, a country better known for millet, sorghum, and the hard realities of the Sahel, that tree carried a question far larger than its branches. What if cacao, a crop associated with the humid lands of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, could take root here too? And what if one successful experiment could become the beginning of something much bigger? That question now sits beside the ambitions of President Ibrahim Traoré, who has openly challenged his country to believe it can become a serious cacao producer. But this story is not really about defeating Ghana, overtaking Côte d'Ivoire, or chasing a dramatic ranking. It is about something more important. Who keeps the wealth after an African resource leaves African soil? Before any national ambition, there was André Bayala, a Burkinabe chocolatier, who had spent years thinking about that problem. For him, cacao was never merely a bean shipped abroad. It could become cocoa butter, cocoa powder, chocolate, skilled work, local businesses, and eventually a Burkinabe brand. Around 2019, Bayala began experimenting with cacao trees in Burkina Faso. Years later, the experiment produced its first results. That did not prove that hundreds of thousands of hectares could suddenly flourish across the Sahel. It proved something smaller, but potentially historic. Under the right conditions, cacao could bear fruit in Burkina Faso. And that is where our investigation begins. We will follow this story from Bayala's first trees to Traoré's national vision, from the struggle for water to the lessons of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, and finally, to the hidden economics inside a bar of chocolate. If you believe Africa's future depends not only on owning resources but on controlling what happens to them afterward, follow this channel, because the real question is not how many cacao trees Burkina Faso can plant. It is how much value Burkina Faso can keep when those trees finally bear fruit. For a nation long accustomed to exporting raw potential, that difference could determine whether cacao becomes another commodity or an industry. Bayala's experiment mattered because it changed the argument. For years, the question was whether cacao could produce fruit at all in Burkina Faso. His trees offered an early answer, but a few successful trees are not an industry. To move beyond an experiment, the country would need trained growers, reliable water, suitable land, nurseries, financing, processing capacity, and buyers willing to trust a new origin. Then Ibrahim Traoré pushed the conversation onto a national stage. On February 17, 2024, Traoré challenged Burkina Faso to think beyond what others considered realistic. He argued that if the country decided to become a leading cacao exporter within several years, it had the ability to pursue that goal. The importance of those words was not that they guaranteed success. No speech can make rain fall or cacao trees survive. The importance was that a marginal experiment suddenly became connected to a political idea. Burkina Faso should stop assuming that its economic possibilities have been decided by geography, history, or foreign markets. That message reached people taking risks. Growers experimenting with cacao could now see their work as part of a national possibility rather than an isolated curiosity. Traoré gave political visibility to an idea that pioneers such as Bayala had begun testing with their own hands. But this is also where facts must remain separate from ambition. There is no reliable evidence that Traoré has officially approved a 200,000 hectare cacao program in Burkina Faso. That figure should therefore not be treated as an accomplished government plan. Instead, consider it as a test of scale. What would Burkina Faso actually need if cacao someday expanded toward an area that enormous? The answer begins with something more difficult than political determination. It begins with systems. Thousands of farmers would need training. Millions of seedlings would need care. Water would have to arrive during dry periods. Harvest would need collection, fermentation, processing, and markets. Traoré can enlarge the ambition. Bayala can demonstrate possibility. But between one pioneering tree and a national cacao economy stands an entire chain that Burkina Faso would have to build. The distance between an experiment and a national industry can be measured in numbers. Recent reporting has described roughly 31,500 cacao plants being introduced across about 50 hectares in Burkina Faso. That is meaningful progress. It suggests cacao is moving beyond a handful of privately tended trees and entering a broader agricultural experiment. But 50 hectares also reveals how enormous the next step would be. Consider the figure of 200,000 hectares. We have not found reliable evidence that Ibrahim Traoré has officially approved a cacao program of that size. In fact, a confirmed 200,000 hectare cacao expansion plan comes from Ghana, a country with generations of experience growing the crop. That distinction matters. Yet, the number remains useful for one reason. It shows what true scale would demand. Going from 50 hectares to anything approaching 200,000 would not mean simply distributing more seedlings. Burkina Faso would need an agricultural system capable of supporting them for years. Nurseries would have to produce healthy plants. Farmers would need land and technical instruction. Roads would have to connect producing areas with collection centers. Harvested beans would require fermentation and drying under controlled standards. Processors would need predictable supplies before investing heavily in factories. And cacao is not a crop that rewards impatience. A government can distribute seedlings in one season, but farmers must protect those trees through dry periods before meaningful harvests arrive. If thousands of farmers are expected to take that risk, they need confidence that someone will eventually buy what they produce. This is where ambition must become planning. Burkina Faso does not need to begin by proving it can command 200,000 hectares. It needs to prove that 50 hectares can become 500 successfully, that 500 can become several thousand without destroying profitability, and that every expansion creates a stronger chain behind the farmer. Because the most dangerous mistake would be counting planted trees as success. The real measurements are survival, yield, farmer income, processing capacity, and market demand. And behind every one of those measurements stands the question that could determine the entire project. Where would the water come from? Water may be the hardest reality standing between Burkina Faso and a large cacao industry. Cacao is sensitive to prolonged water stress. It developed its reputation in humid tropical regions for a reason. Burkina Faso cannot simply copy the farming model of Côte d'Ivoire, plant thousands of hectares, and expect the Sahel to cooperate. That does not make the experiment impossible. It makes adaptation essential. The early Burkinabe approach points toward irrigation, carefully selected growing areas, shade, and agroforestry. Instead of leaving cacao exposed to punishing heat, other vegetation can help create shade and retain moisture. Irrigation can provide water when rainfall becomes unreliable. Farmers can also learn to recognize stress before young trees are permanently damaged. But every solution creates another question. Water used for cacao cannot be considered in isolation. Burkina Faso also needs water for families, livestock, millet, sorghum, corn, rice, vegetables, and other crops that directly support food security. If cacao expands, policymakers must know whether the economic return justifies the water it consumes. This concern actually connects the present to an older Burkinabe vision. Thomas Sankara repeatedly treated control of water as fundamental to agricultural independence. Decades later, the principle remains remarkably relevant. Sovereignty means little if farmers remain completely dependent on unpredictable rainfall. For Traore, that makes water infrastructure more important than dramatic planting numbers. Imagine two programs. The first distributes 1 million seedlings, photographs the planting ceremonies, and later discovers that most trees cannot survive the dry seasons. The second begins smaller, measures water use, trains farmers, improves irrigation, protects food production, and expands only when the economics work. The second may look less spectacular at first, but it is far closer to real independence. Burkina Faso, therefore, should not measure cacao's success by how many seedlings enter the ground. It should measure survival rates, yields, water consumption, farmer income, and the effect on food production. If those numbers work, cacao could expand responsibly. If they do not, political ambition must adjust to agricultural reality. Because before Burkina Faso can challenge the traditional geography of cacao, it must first solve the challenge the Sahel has presented for generations: how to make every drop of water create lasting value. If Burkina Faso wants to build a cacao industry, it does not need to invent everything from the beginning. Two of the world's greatest cacao laboratories are already nearby: Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Together, their experience offers Burkina Faso decades of lessons about what works and what can go wrong. Africa accounted for roughly 69% of global cacao production in the 2024 to 2025 season. Côte d'Ivoire produced about 1,681,000 tons, while Ghana produced roughly 600,000 tons. Burkina Faso is nowhere near those numbers, and it does not need to pretend otherwise. The smarter approach is to learn. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire understand seed selection, fermentation, drying, quality control, purchasing systems, farmer organization, and international markets. Their experience could help Burkina Faso avoid years of expensive mistakes, but their problems matter just as much as their successes. Ghana has struggled with aging cacao trees, disease, pressure on agricultural land, and unstable production. Across the region, farmers remain exposed to changing weather and international prices. Producing enormous quantities of cacao has not eliminated economic vulnerability. That should change the way Burkina Faso defines victory. The goal should not simply be to plant until the country appears on a global ranking. It should be to build a younger and more adaptable industry that learns from its neighbors before repeating their difficulties. Cooperation could be far more valuable than rivalry. Burkinabe farmers could learn cultivation and fermentation techniques from experienced West African producers. Researchers could study varieties suited to hotter and drier conditions. Processors could learn what quality international buyers require before large harvests arrive. This is where Traore's ambition can become practical rather than symbolic. Burkina Faso does not have to defeat Ghana or Côte d'Ivoire. It can use their experience as a shortcut. And once that lesson is understood, another question becomes unavoidable. If these countries have supplied the world with cacao for generations, why does so much of the most valuable economic activity still happen after the beans leave the farm? To understand that, we have to stop counting tons and start following the money. Follow one cacao bean and the real economic challenge becomes clearer. On the farm, it begins as a raw agricultural product. After harvest, however, that same bean can be fermented, dried, cleaned, roasted, ground, pressed into cocoa butter, processed into cocoa powder, transformed into chocolate, packaged under a brand, transported, marketed, and finally sold to consumers. At every stage, somebody earns income. That is why producing cacao and controlling the cacao economy are not the same thing. Research on Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire illustrates the problem. In 2019, raw cacao beans represented roughly 62% of Ghana's cacao export value, and about 72% of Côte d'Ivoire. Finished chocolate represented only a very small share. These countries grow enormous quantities of the crop, yet important stages of value creation still take place elsewhere. A separate study of European chocolate chains found an even more striking pattern. Brands and retailers near the consumer captured around 70% of total value and roughly 90% of total margins across the chain studied. Producers provide the essential raw material, but the greatest commercial rewards can accumulate much farther from the farm. This is where Burkina Faso has an unusual opportunity. Because its cacao sector is still small, it can ask a question at the beginning that older industries have spent decades trying to answer later. Why build a cacao economy designed mainly to export beans? Imagine instead that a growing share of the harvest is fermented to high standards inside Burkina Faso, processed into cocoa butter and powder there, and eventually turned into chocolate-carrying Burkinabe brands. Each additional step could support technicians, factory workers, transport companies, packaging businesses, marketers, and young entrepreneurs. Not every bean must remain inside the country. Exporting raw cacao can still bring valuable income. The issue is balance and control. For Traore, therefore, the most meaningful target may not be 200,000 hectares or first place on an export ranking. A better measurement would be how much value remains in Burkina Faso from every ton produced, and that brings André Bayala back to the center of the story. His greatest contribution may not be proving that cacao can grow there. It may be demonstrating why Burkina Faso should learn to turn its own cacao into chocolate. Turning cacao into chocolate inside Burkina Faso would require more than factories. It would require people who understand every stage between a young tree and a finished product. This is where André Bayala's experience meets the broader economic vision promoted by Ibrahim Traoré. Bayala has emphasized a basic problem. Cacao is demanding, and farmers cannot simply receive seedlings and be expected to succeed. Young growers need practical training. They must understand water management, shade, disease, harvesting, fermentation, and quality. Training centers and cooperatives could therefore become as important as the plantations themselves. The opportunity extends far beyond farming. A domestic cacao chain could create work in nurseries, irrigation, transportation, storage, processing, packaging, maintenance, marketing, and chocolate production. For young Burkinabe who see few opportunities outside agriculture or migration that matters, the objective would not simply be to create more farmers. It would be to create an ecosystem of skills around the Burkinabe product. That idea fits Traore's wider emphasis on domestic production and processing. His government has promoted agricultural modernization and community entrepreneurship as tools for economic sovereignty. Applied to cacao, the principle is straightforward. Produce more locally, process more locally, and allow more of the resulting income to circulate locally. But there is an important warning. Ghana already has substantial cacao processing capacity. Yet, some facilities have operated far below their potential. A factory without enough beans, reliable energy, working capital, or customers does not create sovereignty. It creates an expensive building. Burkina Faso should therefore grow its processing capacity alongside its cacao supply, not years ahead of it. Start with farmers who are properly trained. Organize cooperatives capable of maintaining quality and combining harvest. Develop small and medium processing businesses. Build domestic demand. Expand regional sales. Then increase industrial capacity as the supply becomes reliable. This is the difference between announcing an industry and constructing one. Traore can provide political direction and Bayala can transfer knowledge, but lasting success will depend on thousands of ordinary Burkinabe mastering the work between the field and the marketplace. If that happens, cacao would no longer represent only another crop. It could become a training ground for a larger idea. African raw materials, creating African skills, African businesses, and African wealth. The deeper meaning of Burkina Faso's cacao experiment reaches beyond agriculture. It touches an older argument about what African independence should mean economically. Thomas Sankara understood that political sovereignty could remain incomplete if African countries continued producing raw materials while much of the processing, branding, and commercial power remained elsewhere. In 1987, he argued for an Africa capable of producing in Africa, processing in Africa, and consuming African products. Decades later, cacao offers a practical way to revisit that principle. Sankara provided the idea. André Bayala provided a small demonstration of what local transformation could look like. He did not merely import cacao and accept that chocolate belonged to foreign factories. He built knowledge around processing and then went further by testing whether the cacao itself could grow on Burkinabe soil. Traore now represents the possibility of taking that logic to a larger scale. But Pan-African economic thinking should not turn Burkina Faso against Ghana or Côte d'Ivoire. That would miss the greater opportunity. These countries possess knowledge Burkina Faso needs. Ghanaian and Ivorian growers understand cacao diseases, fermentation, quality, and international buyers in ways a new producer cannot immediately reproduce. Imagine cooperation instead of rivalry. Knowledge developed in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire could help Burkinabe farmers. Burkina Faso could experiment with cultivation adapted to harsher conditions. Processing businesses could serve regional markets. African brands could sell more finished chocolate across African borders instead of treating Europe as the only destination that matters. That is what economic Pan-Africanism can look like when stripped of slogans. It means African knowledge helping African production. It means African factories transforming African crops. It means African consumers becoming a market for African brands. And it means countries cooperating so that more value remains on the continent before goods enter the wider world. Burkina Faso does not have to dominate the global cacao market to contribute to that change. If it can demonstrate that a new producer can deliberately build processing, skills, ownership, and regional trade alongside agriculture, its influence could exceed its production numbers. Then Bayala's cacao tree would represent something much larger than an agricultural experiment. It would become a test of whether an old African economic aspiration can finally be built one value chain at a time. If Burkina Faso moves deeper into cacao processing, some may be tempted to describe the story as Africa against the West. The reality is more complicated and more revealing. There is no reliable evidence that Europe or the United States has launched a campaign to stop Burkina Faso from developing cacao. Claims that Western governments are frightened by Burkinabe chocolate or secretly trying to destroy Traore's cacao ambitions go beyond what the evidence supports. But no conspiracy is required to see the economic imbalance. Africa produces most of the world's cacao, while many of the most profitable activities occur farther along the chain. Research on European chocolate supply chains has found that brands and retailers can capture a very large share of the final value and margins. Europe has processing capacity, financing, logistics networks, famous brands, and access to wealthy consumer markets. African farmers often enter that system much earlier when cacao is worth far less. That creates a legitimate conflict of economic interests. There is another challenge. European rules on deforestation require cacao entering the European market to meet increasingly demanding traceability and land use standards. The environmental purpose is legitimate. Forest destruction should not be ignored, and sustainable production benefits Africa as well. The fair question is who carries the cost? If a small African farmer must pay more to document land, trace production, and satisfy foreign standards while remaining trapped at the least profitable end of the chain, then compliance alone will not solve the deeper inequality. Burkina Faso therefore needs a strategy stronger than blaming France, Europe, or foreign corporations. It needs the capacity to meet high standards while simultaneously moving into processing, branding, and regional trade. That is a far more powerful response than confrontation for its own sake. Economic sovereignty does not require Burkina Faso to close its doors to Western markets. It means entering those markets from a stronger position. The real challenge for Traore is not proving that Burkina Faso can reject the existing system. It is proven that the country can participate in global trade without accepting forever the lowest value position inside it. In the end, Burkina Faso does not need to become the world's largest cacao producer for this experiment to matter. It does not need 200,000 hectares tomorrow, and that figure should not be mistaken for a confirmed government cacao program. Success can be measured differently. If farmers earn more, young people gain useful skills, local businesses process more of the harvest, and Burkinabe brands capture more value before cacao leaves the country, then even a smaller industry could represent a significant economic change. That lesson extends far beyond cacao. African nations have spent generations exporting cotton, coffee, minerals, oil, gold, and agricultural commodities. The question is no longer simply how much Africa possesses. The harder question is who performs the work that makes those resources dramatically more valuable? Who owns the factory? Who controls processing? Who builds the brand? Who reaches the customer? And when the final product is sold, where does the wealth remain? Ibrahim Traoré's cacao ambition will ultimately be judged by those questions, not by speeches. The real achievement would be proving that Burkina Faso can produce, process, own, and sell more of what its own land creates. That debate matters across West Africa and the Sahel. From Burkina Faso to Mali and Niger, leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani have placed sovereignty at the center of political debate. Their choices will continue attracting attention from France, the African Union, and the wider world. For anyone following African news, the lasting question is whether political sovereignty can become productive economic capacity. And now I want your judgment. Should Burkina Faso push aggressively into cacao, or should it move slowly until water, food security, and profitability are proven? Share your view in the comments. And if you want to follow how African nations are trying to turn resources into industries, jobs, and lasting wealth, subscribe and stay with us. Because André Bayala began with a tree, Traore helped turn that tree into a national question. What happens next will determine whether cacao remains an experiment or becomes evidence that Africa can keep more of the value it creates. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.